Everyone ignored her except one millionaire with a baby who stopped and told her something that, "You call that music? Sounds like a dying cat." The man's voice pierced the cold air as he paused on the sidewalk, frowning at the hunched figure near the abandoned bus stop. His breath fogged in the freezing air as he shook his head, disgusted. "This is New York, sweetheart. If you want money, try working for it, not torturing people." The girl on the ground didn't look up. Her fingers trembled against the strings of her battered violin. The bow skipped, snagged, faltered, but she kept playing. The melody, if it could be called that, limped along, jagged and broken, like footsteps on shattered glass. "I just need a few dollars just for tonight," she said softly, her voice dry from the cold, brittle like autumn leaves. Her lips were chapped, cheeks flushed red beneath the grime. The man laughed bitterly and walked away, his shoes crunching against the snow-covered pavement. A group of teens passed moments later. One raised a phone, recording. "Yo, check this out, straight-up horror movie soundtrack. Bet this goes viral," he said, laughing. Another girl in the group mimicked the squeaky notes, exaggerating every move. They jeered as they walked on, the sound of their laughter lingering. Betty closed her eyes for a second, held her breath, and lifted the bow again. The wind screamed down the street, slicing through her thin coat like paper. Her violin was cracked, missing a string, its once rich varnish chipped and faded. She had carried it through shelters, subway tunnels, park benches. It was the only thing that never left her. She drew the bow across the strings again. The sound that came out was raw, aching, jagged. But underneath it all was something else. Pain, yes, but also defiance. She was not asking. She was existing. Her music was a protest against being forgotten. Then the rumble of an engine broke through the silence. A sleek black Bentley slowed to a stop beside the curb. The contrast between the car's gleaming body and the dirty slush on the street was jarring. The passenger door opened. A man stepped out, tall, dressed in a charcoal coat that looked both expensive and worn from too many nights without rest. In his arms, a baby writhed, red-faced, tiny fists curled tightly, crying hoarsely. Betty kept playing. The man did not speak. He stood still, just watching. And slowly, incredibly, the child stopped crying. The music was not beautiful in the traditional sense. It was cracked, weary, but there was something soothing about it. Maybe it was the rhythm, maybe the honesty. The baby blinked once, then twice, and its tiny body relaxed. A soft sigh escaped its lips, and then sleep. The man's shoulders lowered, a fraction. He looked at the girl now, really looked. Her cheeks were raw from the wind. Her gloves were fingerless, soaked through. The violin's case was a broken plastic box. She had no hat, no scarf. He stepped closer. With one hand, he reached into his coat and pulled out his wallet. Silently, he took a crisp $100 bill and placed it into her container. Betty froze. "I haven't slept in 3 days," he said, his voice gravelly from exhaustion. "She hasn't either. No white noise, no lullabies, no medicine, but your music, it worked." Betty looked at him now, really looked. His eyes were deep-set, rimmed with fatigue but warm. "Honest. Thank you," she whispered. The man didn't say anything for a second. Then he unwound the dark gray scarf from around his neck and gently draped it over her shoulders. She stiffened, startled. "Here," he said, his tone low, careful. From the car he retrieved a silver thermos and a collapsible cup. He poured tea, steam curling upward like a prom, and handed it to her. "It's just chamomile, no strings attached." She took it, her hands shaking, and held the warm cup close. The steam stung her cracked lips. The heat felt like a miracle. "I'm Justin," he said finally. "And that's Sophie," Betty nodded. "Betty." Justin crouched slightly, looking her in the eye. "Do you have somewhere warm to go?" Betty hesitated. She looked down, as if embarrassed by the truth. "No." "Then come with me," he said gently. "Just for the night. Just until you're warm." She stared at him. This man was a stranger, a man in a Bentley with a sleeping baby, offering her tea, kindness, a ride. Everything in her said run, that people like him did not help girls like her. But Sophie stirred, made a soft baby noise in her sleep. and Betty looked at her. Then she looked back at Justin. His eyes hadn't changed. Still calm, still kind. "Okay," she whispered. She stood slowly, clutching her violin, scarf still draped over her shoulders. Justin opened the door. She stepped in, cautious, like someone entering a church for the first time. As the Bentley pulled away from the curb, the snow continued to fall, silent, steady, and somehow, suddenly, less cold. The city lights gave way to quiet streets lined with trees and elegant buildings as the Bentley moved deeper into the Upper East Side. Betty sat in silence, clutching her violin case tightly to her chest. The scarf around her shoulders still held the faint scent of cedar and something clean, something safe. She watched the world pass by through the tinted window, eyes wide and wary, heart thudding with every turn the car took. Justin glanced at her only once, briefly, through the rearview mirror. He did not ask questions. Sophie remained asleep in her car seat, her chest rising and falling with a rhythm that seemed almost too delicate for this world. When the car finally stopped, Betty saw it. A tall, stately house behind a black wrought-iron gate. It was not ostentatious, not dripping in gold or glass, but it was large, clearly expensive, and glowing softly from within. Warm light spilled through the windows like a silent invitation. Justin stepped out, gently lifted Sophie from her seat, then opened the door for Betty. She hesitated. Her boots, wet and torn, hovered just above the clean stone of the walkway. "You are safe here," Justin said quietly. Betty nodded, more to herself than to him, and stepped out. The door opened before they even reached it. A woman in her late 60s stood in the entrance, her gray hair twisted into a neat bun, apron spotless. Her face was kind, her eyes bright. "Mr. Caldwell," she said with a smile, "and this must be our guest." "This is Betty," Justin said. The woman turned to her. "I'm Clara. I've made up the guest room. Come in, dear, it's freezing out." Betty stepped inside. The house smelled like vanilla and something floral. Lavender, maybe? There were bookshelves lining the hallway, soft rugs underfoot, and gentle lighting that made everything feel lived in, not just beautiful but warm, human. Clara led the way up a short flight of stairs. The room was small compared to the house but large by Betty's standards. A bed with a thick quilt, a dresser with a vase of fresh flowers, and a small armchair by the window. Betty stood at the threshold, frozen. She shook her head. I don't need all that," she murmured. "The floor is fine, really." Clara's smile faltered only for a moment, then returned, soft and understanding. "Of course, dear, whatever makes you comfortable." Betty sank to the floor in the corner, tucking her violin close to her chest like a shield. She pulled the scarf tighter, her eyes darting around the room, looking for hidden traps that weren't there. Justin appeared in the doorway. He held another cup of tea, steam rising gently. "You do not have to be on edge," he said calmly. "You helped my daughter sleep. That matters more to me than you know." He placed the tea on the nightstand and stepped back. "I'll let you rest. Good night, Betty." He left without closing the door fully. It remained cracked just a little, like a silent promise. Betty did not touch the bed. She sat on the floor for a long time, sipping the tea in small, cautious sips. Her body ached from the cold, but she refused to lie down. Around midnight, she heard soft footsteps in the hall. She stiffened, heart racing. Her fingers gripped the violin case. The door creaked open gently. "Just bringing an extra blanket," Clara whispered, setting it at the foot of the bed. "You might get cold." Betty said nothing. Clara nodded once and left, the door closing with a quiet click. Betty stared at the blanket for a long time. Then, slowly, she reached out and pulled it over herself. She leaned back against the wall, curled into herself, and closed her eyes. She had slept on sidewalks, in train stations, behind dumpsters, but here, on this floor with a blanket that smelled like sunshine, she did not shiver. For the first time in years, Betty slept without fear. The house was quiet in the early mornings, save for the occasional soft cry from Sophie, echoing down the hallway. Betty, though still unsure if she truly belonged, had begun to wake before anyone else. Wrapped in the navy scarf Justin had given her, she would tiptoe downstairs, violin case in hand, and sit in the sunlit corner of the living room near the grand bay windows. It became a rhythm. By the third morning, Sophie stirred as usual around 6:15 a.m., and Clara, ever graceful, brought her into the room where Betty waited. The baby would calm instantly at the sight of her and the gentle sounds that followed. Each evening, too, Betty played beside Sophie's crib. Her notes were soft, tentative at first, but grew steadier as the days passed. The music was no longer harsh survival. It was a lullaby, spun from the same hands that had once trembled in the snow. One night, as the last of her notes lingered in the air, Betty passed Justin's study and glimpsed him through the half-open door. He sat in a deep leather chair, his tall frame slouched forward. In his hands was a photo frame, worn at the edges. The woman in the picture, Anna, smiled brightly in a summer garden, her arms cradling a newborn Sophie. Betty froze. Justin's head was bowed, his thumb brushing the glass in slow, aching circles. His eyes were red, but he made no sound. There were no sobs, just silence. A silence heavy with Betty quietly turned away. She returned to the guest room and sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time since arriving, she placed the violin gently on the comforter instead of hugging it to sleep. Something had shifted. The next morning, over a quiet breakfast of oatmeal and tea, Justin cleared his throat. "You saw me last night," he said without looking up. Betty hesitated. Spoon paused mid-air. "I did not mean to. I was just walking past." He nodded slowly, then met her eyes. Anna passed away 3 days after Sophie was born. Complications. She held Sophie once, and then she was gone. Betty lowered her gaze, unsure of what to say. "I do not know how to do this," he continued. "Being a father, being alone. Some days I feel like I am going through motions I do not understand. But when Sophie hears your music," he exhaled, "she sleeps. And I breathe." Betty looked at him, eyes softening. "I have never seen someone grieve so quietly," she said. Justin gave a small, broken smile. "I have never let anyone see me cry." Betty said nothing more. But that night, when Sophie stirred, her lullaby was fuller, richer. She played not only to soothe the child, but to reach out, maybe not in words, but in the only language she trusted. Despite the warmth of the house, Betty still kept her boundaries. She washed her own clothes by hand in the bathroom sink. She drank tea from the dented thermos she carried when she arrived. The guest room remained sparsely touched. The drawers were empty, the closet door never opened. Clara noticed, of course, but she never pried. Justin, too, respected the invisible walls Betty maintained. He offered no lectures, no demands, just space. In time, Betty began to read some of the books lining the living room shelves. She found an old collection of Chopin's nocturnes, pages worn and marked in pencil. She practiced them quietly during the day when no one watched. Sophie started to recognize her melody. One afternoon, as Betty played near the nursery window, Sophie, now 4 months old, reached out a chubby hand and touched the strings. It made a strange sound, awkward and squeaky. Betty laughed genuinely, a sound even she had almost forgotten. That night she wrote in a small notebook Clara had left on the bedside table, "Music used to keep me alive, now it keeps me human." The late afternoon light spilled across the nursery as Sophie clapped her tiny hands, trying to mimic the beat Betty tapped gently on the wooden floor. 1, 2, 1, 2, Betty said softly, her smile cautious but sincere. Sophie giggled in response, wobbling slightly in her attempt to stand. Each day brought small steps like this. Baby laughter, shared glances, melodies played without a need for reason. Betty was beginning to settle into the rhythm of the house, of caring, of being seen. And yet, inside her, a quiet storm brewed. That storm struck one chilly Tuesday afternoon. Betty was halfway to the kitchen when a sharp pain clenched her lower abdomen, stopping her cold. Her knees buckled, and she barely caught the edge of the wall before sinking to the floor. Sweat broke out on her forehead, and she curled inward, trying to breathe through the stabbing sensation. The next thing she heard was hurried footsteps. "Betty?" Justin's voice was taut with concern. He dropped beside her, eyes scanning her pale face, his hand reaching for her shoulder. What happened? Are you hurt?" "I am fine," she muttered through clenched teeth. "You are clearly not fine." She tried to sit up. "It is just pain. It will pass. I do not need your pity." Justin stilled. He looked at her for a moment, his brow furrowed, then said quietly, "This is not pity, Betty. This is concern. This is admiration." He hesitated, his voice firm yet tender. "You are stronger than you think." Betty turned away from him, jaw tight. Her body trembled from both pain and shame. She was not used to being helped, not like this. She was used to hiding her pain in alleyways, wrapping it in silence and swallowing it whole. Justin said nothing more. He stood and walked to the nearby bookshelf, retrieved a warm water bottle Clara had tucked there just in case, and set it gently by her side. Then he crossed to the window, his back to her, watching the trees sway in the wind outside. He was giving her space. That simple act, more than any words, unraveled something inside her. Betty stared at the water bottle for a long time before slowly pressing it to her side. The warmth seeped in, not just through her skin but through the walls she had wrapped around herself. She felt tears prick her eyes and turned away to hide them. She fell asleep on the couch later that evening, the violin beside her, untouched. At dusk, she woke to Sophie's soft cries. Betty rose, slower than usual, but made her way to the nursery. The baby reached out instinctively, her face lighting up at the sight of Betty. That small gesture, pure, without expectation, soothed the ache inside. That night, Betty sat by the crib and played. The notes were lower, slower, touched with pain, but also resolution. She was not playing for survival. She was not playing for someone else. She was playing for the girl she used to be. The one who, long ago, sat in a cramped apartment while her mother hummed over a pot of boiling water and said, "Let the music take the hunger away." Betty's fingers moved with memory and longing. In the hallway, Justin leaned silently against the doorframe. He listened with eyes closed, arms folded, not daring to speak. He knew this music was not meant for him, but he also knew it meant she was healing. Little by little, note by note. The air in the nursery was filled with quiet giggles and the soft rustling of pages as Betty held Sophie on her lap, gently reading a picture book aloud. Sophie, now 10 months old, leaned against her with complete trust, her chubby hand resting on Betty's arm, eyes wide with curiosity. It had become a routine now. Morning lullabies, playful clapping games, whispered bedtime stories. Betty had found herself woven into the fabric of Sophie's world, steadily, almost without realizing it. The little girl's face lit up each time Betty entered the room, and when she cried, only Betty's voice seemed to calm her. One evening, as the sky turned a soft rose above the tall windows of the house, Justin approached Betty while she was folding Sophie's tiny clothes on the living room couch. His hands were in his pockets, and he looked uncharacteristically uncertain. "Betty," he began, "I have been thinking." She looked up, her expression neutral. "You have become more than just a guest in this house. Sophie adores you. She laughs with you. She sleeps when you play. I know it might sound formal, but would you consider becoming her nanny? Officially, I mean." Betty blinked, startled. "Nanny?" she repeated, as if testing the word on her tongue. "I am not asking because of your music," Justin continued, kneeling slightly to meet her eye. "I am asking because you are the only person she smiles for some days. You are her person, and that means everything." Betty set down a folded onesie, her hands suddenly feeling too big. "I do not have the qualifications, no training, no degree." Justin's voice softened. "You have a heart. You care for her like she is your own. No paper certificate could matter more than that." Silence stretched between them. Then Justin stood and stepped out of the room. A few moments later, he returned, holding a long rectangular case wrapped in a soft velvet cloth. He set it gently on the table in front of her. "I have something for you." Betty eyed the case warily, then slowly opened it. Inside lay her violin, no longer cracked, no longer missing a string. The wood gleamed, restored but not replaced, its scars polished into something beautiful. The familiar curve of the neck, the subtle grain of the body, it was hers, but whole. "I found someone to repair it," Justin said. "Someone who understood that not everything broken needs to be replaced. Some things deserve a second chance. Betty's breath caught. Her fingers hovered above the instrument, trembling. I thought, Justin added quietly, maybe you deserve that chance too. The words hit deeper than he probably intended. Betty stood abruptly, trying to steady herself. Her eyes brimmed with tears, and she turned away, brushing them off with the back of her sleeve. Why are you doing this? She whispered. You do not owe me anything. No, he replied, but I am grateful. For you, for what you have brought into this home, and for what you have brought back into me. Betty looked at the violin again. That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep in the hush of twilight, Betty sat alone in the music room. The violin lay on her lap like a trusted friend returned from a long journey. She cradled it gently, ran her fingers along the strings, then lifted the bow. She played, not to chase away hunger, not to drown out the cold, but for joy. The music was different this time, lighter, freer. It curled through the warm air like birdsong after a storm. It was a song of possibility, of cautious hope, of roots beginning to reach for solid ground, and in the hallway, once again, Justin paused and listened, without a word, without moving. He knew better now than to interrupt the moment, because it belonged to her. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting golden rectangles on the marble floor. Betty was in the kitchen, feeding Sophie mashed banana, when Clara walked in with a newspaper folded tightly in her hand. Betty, she said softly, I think you should see this. Betty wiped her hands on a dishcloth and took the paper. Her heart began to pound as her eyes landed on the headline, splashed across the front of the lifestyle section. Millionaire and the Violin Girl, a secret or a sympathy project. The article was written by James Lawton, Justin's longtime friend and a well-known columnist known for stirring the pot. The piece detailed how a mysterious homeless violinist had been taken into the Caldwell estate, implying a relationship born out of Justin's loneliness and misplaced charity rather than love or sincerity. It mentioned her playing in the streets, how she moved in without credentials, and speculated on the emotional instability of a widowed father making reckless decisions. Betty's face drained of color. She stood frozen in the middle of the room, the paper trembling in her hand. Later that day, when Justin returned from a meeting, she was waiting by the door, the article crumpled tightly in her fist. Did you see this? She asked quietly. I did, Justin replied, voice even. I cannot stay here, she said. Not when people think, when they think you took me in like some charity case. What if Sophie grows up and reads this? What if it hurts her? Justin stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. People will always have something to say. But they do not live here. They do not know Sophie, or you, or us. Betty shook her head. This is your world, Justin. I do not belong in it, and I refuse to be the reason your name is dragged through the mud. I am not worried about my name, he said. I am worried about Sophie, about what it will mean to her if the woman she loves disappears. Her breath hitched, but she stayed quiet. And I am worried, he added, softer now, about losing the piece of this home that only you can fill. She looked at him, eyes burning. This is not about pity, Betty, or charity. You are family. You belong here, not because of what you do for Sophie, but because of who you are. Still, she could not ignore the churning inside her, shame, doubt, old wounds reopened by cruel words printed in black and white. That night, she packed a small bag and moved her things to a guest room farther down the hall. Just until this blows over, she told Clara, who only nodded, her eyes kind but sad. In the days that followed, Betty kept her distance from Justin. She remained devoted to Sophie, playing with her, feeding her, humming lullabies each evening. But she avoided the quiet dinners and long walks they once shared. The warmth that had begun to grow between them now sat waiting in a corner, unsaid and unresolved. One evening, as the city lights blinked through the nursery window, Betty held Sophie in her arms and rocked her gently. The violin rested beside her on the chair. She lifted it slowly, ran her fingers across the strings, and began to play. The melody was soft, almost hesitant, but her notes wove themselves around the little girl like a blanket. Sophie stirred once, then stilled, her tiny hand curling into Betty's shirt. Tears welled in Betty's eyes as she played. She played through the ache in her chest, through the storm of shame and fear, through the memory of Justin's words, "You are family." The music trembled, then steadied, because she realized in that moment no headline could define her bond with Sophie. No gossip could undo what had been built in quiet moments of care, of laughter, of song. And as her bow slowed and the last note faded, Betty bent down and kissed Sophie's forehead. "I am still here," she whispered, "and I am not leaving." The night was unusually quiet. A snowstorm had swept across New York, knocking out power in several neighborhoods. The Caldwell residence, tucked away on the Upper East Side, was wrapped in a soft silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of firewood. Betty sat on a thick rug in front of the fireplace, her arms gently wrapped around little Sophie, now a bright, curious toddler. The glow of the flames danced across their faces, casting long shadows on the walls. Justin, having lit every candle he could find in the house, settled into a chair nearby, a blanket draped across his lap. "There was a time," he began, his voice low, "when I hated the dark." Betty looked up, surprised by the sudden confession. "Why?" He stirred the fire slowly. "Because it reminded me of the group home. After my mother left, I spent most of my childhood there. We had one bulb in the hallway, barely working. At night, it felt like the world forgot about us." Betty remained quiet, listening. Justin's voice trembled slightly, but he pressed on. "I used to count footsteps. Every creak in the floor meant someone was near. Every silence meant you were still alone." Sophie stirred, letting out a tiny yawn before snuggling deeper into Betty's arms. "She is lucky," Betty whispered. "She will never know that kind of fear." "That is because of you," Justin replied softly. "You brought light back into this house, Betty. Not just for Sophie. For me, too." Betty's heart skipped. She looked at him. There was no plea in his expression, no expectation, just quiet sincerity. "My mom used to play music for me," she said, her voice barely above the hum of the fire. "We had nothing, no heater, no steady meals. But she taught me violin, said if my stomach was empty I could still fill my soul." Justin nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the fire. "That is beautiful. Painful, but beautiful." They sat in silence, the kind that needed no words. After a moment, Betty reached for her violin. The polished wood glowed in the firelight. She tucked it under her chin and began to play, a soft, slow lullaby that seemed to weave itself into the walls of the room. Each note was a thread, stitching warmth into the cold corners of their memories. Justin closed his eyes. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply listened, as if the music itself was something sacred. When the last note faded, Betty set the violin down. Sophie had fallen asleep in her lap. Betty brushed a strand of hair from the baby's forehead and looked up. Justin was watching her, not with longing, not with pity, but with something deeper, hope. For the first time, Betty felt it too. Not the fear of losing something she did not yet understand, but the quiet realization that maybe, just maybe, she belonged. The spring air was gentle, tinged with the fragrance of cherry blossoms that danced across the courtyard of Justin's garden. Fairy lights lined the low hedges, casting a golden glow as twilight embraced the sky. A small crowd of close friends and staff filled the rows of white chairs under the trees. In the center, under a soft spotlight, Betty stood with her violin. She closed her eyes. Then she began to play. The music was unlike any she had ever played before. It carried joy and longing, gratitude and healing. Each note felt like a chapter of her journey, from the bitter cold bus stop in Brooklyn to the warmth of the home behind her. It was not flawless, but it was human. It was hers. Sophie, now toddling and full of giggles, clapped along enthusiastically from Justin's lap. The little girl had grown strong, confident, and full of spirit, just like her mother would have wanted, just like her second mother had helped her become. As the final note faded into the spring breeze, the applause was immediate and warm. Betty gave a small bow flushed with emotion. When she stepped down from the small platform, she expected nothing more than the peace of a quiet evening. But Justin met her at the bottom of the steps. He held something in his hand, a small box. Betty's eyes widened. He knelt down, right there under the cherry blossoms, as Sophie stood beside him holding the edge of his sleeve. "Betty," he said, voice steady but tender, "you did not just bring music into this house. You brought us back to life. You gave Sophie a mother's love. You gave me hope again. You taught us both how to feel joy without guilt." He opened the box. Inside was a silver ring, simple and elegant, with an engraving on the inside that read, "Our Melody. I love you. Will you marry me?" The world stood still. Betty's hand flew to her mouth. She had not expected this, not after all they had been through, not after how carefully they had respected each other's space and time. But looking at him there, gentle, genuine, and full of love, she knew the answer had always been in her heart. She nodded, tears filling her eyes. "Yes!" The crowd clapped again, but it was Sophie's tiny voice that broke everyone's composure. "Mama!" she said, reaching for Betty. Betty gathered her into her arms, tears falling freely now. There were no grand speeches, just quiet joy, the kind that stays. Months passed. The wedding was small, full of laughter and homemade decorations. Clara cried through most of it. Betty's violin played the bridal march herself. Justin wore the same suit he had worn the night he first met her, quietly sentimental. Betty's belly began to show not long after. She glowed, not from riches or fame, but from peace, from being loved and choosing to love in return. One morning, early, as birds chirped softly outside, Betty sat on the windowsill in the nursery. Sophie lay beside her, curled in a blanket. Inside her, another life stirred gently. She hummed a lullaby, one her mother had taught her long ago, when the world felt too sharp and loud. Justin entered silently, placing a hand on her shoulder. They sat in silence, watching the light creep over the city skyline. "I used to play just to survive," Betty whispered. Justin rested his cheek against her hair. "And now?" She smiled. "Now, I play because I'm finally alive." They stood, hand in hand, and walked into the new day together, with music in their hearts and a family in their arms. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through music, healing, and love. If Betty's story reminded you that even the smallest acts of kindness can lead to the most life-changing moments, then you're in the right place. Here at Soul Stirring Stories, we believe in the quiet miracles that happen when people choose compassion, courage, and connection. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. We share new stories every week, stories that lift your spirit, remind you of hope, and maybe even bring a few tears, because everyone deserves a story that stirs the soul. Until next time, stay kind and stay inspired.